Hi, and welcome to yet another week of class. As you might be able to tell from the dim lighting I'm experiencing right now, we are still covered up with rain here in Raleigh, and the projection is that we will continue to be experiencing rain through Monday. So it's been a while since we've seen the sun here. I think we're all desperately missing it. I think people have been walking around acting super grump the past couple of days, which is understandable because the sun is something that we need in order to be cheerful. And that's not just like a perspective on life, although that is my perspective on life. I think it's actually like scientifically proven that we need something called vitamin D in order to make us have good dispositions, or some such thing like that. Okay, so that's my little warm-up chit-chat talk. I want to go ahead and dive right into this week's lecture. I think it's probably going to be a little bit shorter than what the lectures have been in previous weeks, but we shall see. This week we're going to be talking about two different things: social structure and social institutions. These are two distinct topics, but they're very similar. They're related to one another very closely, and so I always like to teach them together. I think it just makes intuitive sense. I want to start with social structure, but before we actually begin to talk about what social structure is, we need to talk about some of the components of social structure. So just bear with me. We'll build up to where we're going. So the first thing that we should talk about in relation to social structure is this idea of status, this concept of status or status, which is a very fancy word in some ways, but it has a really simple meaning. All it means is a position that a person occupies. Any label that you would give yourself is an example of a status. And so personally, I am a woman, I am a graduate student, I am a partner, a daughter, I am a jogger, right? And on and on and on. We can think of a variety of labels that we would give ourselves, and all of those would be examples of different statuses that we occupy. There are two types of statuses that sociologists talk about. The first is achieved, and as the word implies, these are statuses that we achieve, that we work towards, that we make a conscious decision to label ourselves as. And so a good example of that would be graduate student or jogger. So these are statuses that I self-select into and work towards accomplishing. The other type of status is ascribed. These are statuses that we are born into, so we don't have a whole lot of choice here in these labels. So this would include, for me personally, the statuses of woman. White is another example. I come from a middle class background. That was not a choice I had. So that would be another example of an ascribed status. And now that I bring up this class status issue, this one is a little bit tricky because in America we like to think of our class standing as being something that is achieved, something that we have a whole lot of control over in achieving upward mobility if we so desire. But in a lot of ways, it's also an ascribed status. And I know in mentioning that, some of you are going to have this inclination to not agree or to want to resist this idea a little bit, and that's perfectly understandable, perfectly okay. We'll unpack this a little bit more when we get to our class inequality unit in a couple of weeks. And that's not to suggest that there's no element of achievement when it comes to our class status, but what I am suggesting is that there's maybe not as much of an achievement element as we're taught in our American cultural system. Excuse me. I want to pause here and talk very briefly about the idea of a master status. And so the idea here is that we all occupy multiple statuses simultaneously, and some of our statuses will act as filters to the other ones. So, for example, whenever somebody references a black doctor or a female professor, black and female in those instances would be acting as a master status to that of doctor and professor. And sociologists think that this idea, this use of master statuses is problematic for a couple of reasons. First, in America, we like to think that what we achieve is more important than the statuses that we're born into. And whenever the status that is prescribed to us or our ascribed status acts as a filter to ones that we've achieved, that kind of undermines that cultural belief system. It reinforces that inequality. Secondly, master statuses have a tendency to reinforce expectations about who should occupy certain achieved statuses. So people rarely say, I went and saw my white doctor today, and there's a reason for that, is because there's kind of this unconscious cognitive bias, this expectation that doctors will be white. And so when saying black doctor, it's taking note that as ascribed status of black deviates from the norm or the standard or the expectation that we have of who our doctors are going to be. Again, at the beginning of this semester, I mentioned to you all that I was an inequality scholar, a critical inequality scholar, and so what I'm trying to convey to you, I don't think I'm articulating it all that well, to be honest, is that there is an element of inequality whenever we start to think about the role of master statuses and the uses of them. Even though in the vast majority of cases people do not intend to reproduce or reinforce inequalities when they use these master statuses, that is nonetheless one of those consequences, an unintended consequence. And a lot of this has to do with our cultural, how culture inoculates us from questioning how we phrase things. So that's status. That is one component of social structure. The other component of social structure are roles. These are expectations about behavior attached to particular statuses. And this is a lot like the norms that we learned about last week when we talked about culture, except that in this case they're attached to particular statuses. And so when you think about the statuses that you occupy, I listed several a moment ago. There are expectations of behavior associated with them. There are expectations of behavior associated with what it means to be a graduate student, with what it means to be a jogger. And, you know, in my own life, sometimes I'll wake up in the morning, a day that I'm supposed to go for a jog, and I may not be feeling it for whatever reason, and I will literally consciously tell myself, you are a jogger, and the expectation associated with that status is for you to jog, get your butt out of bed, put your shoes on, and go for a jog. And so I use this example to tell you all how powerful statuses and roles are in affecting our behaviors. Some of you may have noticed that whenever I refer to my husband, we are legally married, I prefer to use the term partner as opposed to husband. And there are a variety of reasons why I do that, but one of them is because of how powerful statuses and roles are in affecting our behaviors. There are a whole slew of expectations associated with the statuses of husband and wives, and a lot of these are inequitable in nature. A lot of these stem from our patriarchal society, and so I actively choose not to kind of embrace that status of husband and wife in order to try to minimize the impact those statuses and the accompanying roles would have in my personal relationships. MacIntyre describes a variety of what she calls tricky situations associated with these roles and statuses. I'm not going to cover them here in the lecture. Make sure that you read and understand them on your own and follow up with me if you have questions. Now that we understand statuses and roles, we can begin to talk about what social structure is. And it's essentially a patterned relationship between statuses and roles. So social life works in such a way that the statuses and roles attached to them are fairly predictable. If I asked you all to describe your daily lives and the statuses that you occupied and the roles associated with them and how you performed those roles, you might be surprised at how similar those descriptions actually are. And that's social structure, right? This structure exerts a force over our lives, making it predictable, and in a lot of ways, making our lives relatively similar to one another. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about social institutions. Social institutions are defined as an accepted and persistent constellation of statuses, roles, values, and norms that respond to important societal needs. So some of you may realize in this definition that it is through social institutions where our culture and our social structure come together. So some of the major social institutions in our society include the economy, law, politics, science, media, education, family would be a big one. Social institutions introduce yet another element of predictability in our lives. By and large, we learn through the process of socialization, if you'll recall, the norms, values, roles, and statuses associated with, for example, the social institution of the economy. There's a good list of what some of these elements look like by social institution on page 141 of the text. So consult that to get a little bit of clarity here. MacIntyre gives a very good, thorough list of the nature of social institutions. This is something that, again, you should read on your own and make sure that you understand. So that's really all that I have to say this week, but I wanted to leave on this note. In addition to considering the nature of social institutions, the list that MacIntyre provides at the end of that chapter, I also want you to begin to think about how somebody from a functionalist perspective may think about social institutions and social structure, and contrast that with how somebody from a more conflict-oriented perspective may think about social institutions and social structure, because those two theoretical perspectives, if you'll recall, are very much in opposition to one another in a lot of ways. And then lastly, how would a symbolic interactionist go about analyzing the social institutions in our society? I'm leaving you with these questions for you to consider and think about on your own. I would welcome you to follow up with me via email or a message board somehow if you have thoughts on the matter. This is also a nice way for me to segue to another kind of housekeeping item I wanted to bring up in this week's lecture, and that is the midterm exam, which is right around the corner in a lot of ways, or it feels like it's right around the corner to me at least. I will be opening the exam on October the 14th, and it closes on October the 18th. So you have a considerable window that you'll be able to take the exam in. Keep in mind here, though, that you must submit it by the end by the deadline. There will not be any exceptions due to technical issues or you running out of time. I just can't accept any of those. You have sufficient time to get it done, so make sure you get it done. Also, I will be posting a very bare bones study guide to kind of help direct you and help at least focus your studying efforts. However, I expect that the vast majority of this effort is going to be on you. So again, bare bones would be the way to describe the study guide that I'm going to provide. It's going to essentially be a list of concepts, and you can look for that sometime this week. So that's all that I have for now. I urge you all to think warm and sunny and dry thoughts for us folks here in Raleigh. I hope wherever you're at, you are staying healthy and well. And as always, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. But for now, I will say goodbye. Goodbye.